She wore invisibility like a uniform. Anna Martinez moved through the dining room of Éclat as if she were a wisp of steam, present, necessary, and easily overlooked. The chandelier spilled pale gold over marble floors. The clink of cutlery and low conversation stitched the room into a soft, continuous hum. Anna's apron lay flat against her hips, her name badge warmed by the heat of 100 dinners. She adjusted the fold at her collar with hands that knew other things: how to steady a trembling cursor on a stubborn line of code, how to proof a paragraph in French. But tonight they were doing the narrow, precise work of carrying plates and answering orders with a smile that didn't always reach the eyes. At the far table, Mrs. Blackwood sat with a scarf pinned at her throat and a light in her face that had nothing to do with the chandelier. She watched the room with the practiced stillness of someone who had learned to be seen in a different way. Her hands moved slowly, deliberately, and a couple at the next table turned to watch the graceful language that slipped between them. When Anna drew near to refill water, she hesitated, then made the small, private choice that had nothing to do with the job description taped by the manager's desk. She raised her fingers and signed a sentence she didn't say aloud. "Thank you. Your scarf is beautiful." Mrs. Blackwood's expression softened, and she signed back with an almost surprised tenderness. The exchange lasted less than 30 seconds, a private island of recognition in the ocean of service, but the effect did not settle within Anna afterward. She felt blinked awake. For a moment, she forgot to be the person everyone assumed, a waitress who'd lost track of something larger. For a moment, the edges of her invisibility frayed. A man at a nearby table watched that fray with the concentration of someone who'd spent a life noticing things other people disregard. Marcus Blackwood leaned back against his chair, a cashmere sweater pulling the silhouette of a habitually precise life into softer lines. He was an heir by name and a principal by habit, concerned with ledgers and launch dates and the way power masked itself in polite displays. He had no reason to study the staff, none except an attention that had hardened into a kind of usefulness. He watched Anna sign and noticed the way her fingers flexed like a pianist's, the way her mouth barely moved as if each shape of language still lived in her throat. A little detail, her graduated fold of the apron, the old Columbia pin threaded through the badge string, told him more than a resume. After Mrs. Blackwood left, with a careful nod and a folded thank you note she passed to Anna, Marcus stood. He asked for the manager and, with the practiced discretion of someone used to getting what he needed, left a small card in the check folder. "Marcus Blackwood, if you'd like to speak about job opportunities or projects." The card was an anomaly in a world of napkin scrawls and credit receipts, a quiet impression of intent. Anna tucked the card into her apron without thinking. She'd kept it, oddly, like a talisman, folded into a small pocket she'd sewn into the waistband. It was not the sort of thing she let herself keep for long. But that night, when the room dimmed and dishes clicked into stacks, she felt the card against her palm like a promise she hadn't earned. She laughed once, a tiny sound she swallowed. For the rest of her shift, she moved through the rhythm of bringing bread, refilling wine, answering the same questions she had heard 10,000 times. She made fewer mistakes than usual. If this is the kind of story that grips you, stick around. There is a beginning here, and it will not let go. Outside the restaurant, New York smelled of rain and engines. Anna walked home with the same bag she carried to Columbia, one that had once been worn thin with textbooks and conference flyers. The city did not look accusatory. It simply continued to be itself, indifferent and full of small possibilities. She unlocked the apartment and let the quiet come down like a curtain. Her laptop, an older model with a conspicuous dent near the hinge, sat on the coffee table, a familiar weight. She booted it up more out of habit than expectation. Her past arrived in small, peculiar files. A zipped folder labeled Martinez _Proto 2017. An email archive she had once tried to save and then been shut out of. A cluster of drafts with her handwriting in the margins. The cloud had been where she'd buried the years she no longer wanted to look at. David Chen, her former partner, had been more efficient than she expected. He had renamed and rebranded, absorbing their work into a company that now moved toward a merger with a conglomerate that kept its announcements in glossy, bloodless press releases. Anna had watched that slow erasure happen like an avalanche from a blocked window. One rumor, then a patent filed in his name, then the occasional polite article that didn't mention who had written the algorithm. There were nights she still felt the old edges of anger, cold and precise, sit like a door behind her sternum. Tonight was not one of those nights. Tonight she let herself be small and tired, the way people are when they work until the last customer leaves and then go home to pick up the pieces of a life someone else rearranged. The next morning a message blinked on her old phone, a single line from an unknown number. Anna, Marcus Blackwood, I noticed you last night. Coffee? I have some questions. She stared at it, thumb hovering over the reply button. It could have been nothing. It could have been the beginning of something that complicated her life in ways she did not need. She deleted the message, and then, a week later, she responded. She couldn't explain why, except to say that curiosity, as much as loneliness, nudged her toward a yes. Marcus did not arrive at the coffee meeting in the manner of a man out to demonstrate power. He arrived composed and concise, the kind of presence that conveyed a battery of resources without uncorking them. Conversation started careful, mutual, neutral. He spoke about investments and philanthropic projects. She answered the way she always answered, defensively competent. He asked about Colombia, and she let herself say she had worked on a natural language processing model to parse financial contracts, an algorithm that had once been her small, private miracle. When she mentioned David, his expression rearranged itself into a question mark. He asked for facts, not feelings. Her voice, which could be steady under fluorescent lights and under feedback, became fragile when it reached certain sentences. Patents gone missing, server logs she couldn't access, the sudden folding of her startup account. The words clustered as if she were trying to hand him a map made from torn paper. He listened like someone who had the means to follow the map. He did not promise quick justice. He promised resources and patience. Marcus's interest did not immediately declare itself romantic. It was professional curiosity folded around a human impulse to look after someone who had been unfairly trampled. He asked questions that led him to the idea of documentation and to the possibility of corroborating proof, something physical and dated, something that a court or a boardroom couldn't simply ignore. Anna pushed back gently. "There is no smoking gun," she said. "There is a lot of smoke and a handful of embers." David was not a cartoon. He had ambition and charm and the particular fossilized confidence of someone who believed rules were made to be interpreted creatively. Marcus had not judged him, yet. He preferred to collect facts. Meanwhile, Anna returned to the restaurant and to the careful choreography of waiting tables. Sarah, the head waitress, watched her with a kind of wary sisterliness. "You need to be careful," Sarah said one day, standing by the pass as Anna slid plates from window to customer. "Big boys like that, he's not your rescue. If he notices you, things change, and not always in the way you think." "Maybe that's okay," Anna answered, and the words surprised even her. She felt a faint uplift when she thought of Marcus. Not because she expected romance, she had no appetite for the suddenness of affection, but because someone had seen her as more than a fixture. It mattered. It opened up the small spaces where hope could breathe. On a late weekday night, when the last of the restaurant's patrons had left and the staff had moved into their usual ritual of clearing, Anna stayed behind. The manager had asked her to stack bottles in the wine cellar. The job was routine and mindless and comfortable. The cellar was a long, cool place under the restaurant, the air smelling of dust, oak, and the faint iron tang of old receipts. Wine racks lined the walls in neat rows, each bottle sounding like a sleepier heart when handled. The chandelier above had no reach down here. Instead, a nominated work light hummed in the corner and painted the cellar in harsh utilitarian glare. Her hands moved through the bottles, aligning labels, recentering the rows. She liked the rhythm, the way the world reduced to a pattern she could fix. Behind a particular rack, a wall panel felt odd under her palm. It was a small departure from the smooth plane of masonry. She paused, set down a bottle. She pressed again. A sliver of space prickled open like the seam of something not meant to be seen. She did not plan to pry. She had no intention of trespassing into a corner of business not in her purview. But she had a habit of looking deeper when the edge of something didn't fit. She hooked a thumb into the seam and gave a gentle, experimental pull. The panel yielded. Inside, recessed like a secret within a secret, a metal rectangle waited, an embedded safe small enough to be concealed behind a false wall, the sort some restaurants use to keep cash and receipts separated from the nightstaff. The safe's external surface was dulled with the sort of grease and dust you get from years of being hidden. A tiny label, half peeled and faded, read, "Accounting Private." Anna's stomach tightened. She should have left it alone. She should have called the manager. Instead, memory worked in a different rhythm. That ember of hope from coffee meetings, the careful way Marcus had listened, the way he'd asked for facts rather than promises. If there was evidence here, something physical, she could not let it be erased, replaced, refiled. She fumbled for the small notepad she carried for orders and scribbled 2 numbers from the dial into the corner, numbers that might have fallen like code into her head after 100 managerial instructions. She found a flashlight and shone it into the safe. Dust lifted like breath. At first, there was nothing but a cluster of envelopes and a small hard case, the kind that hugged a USB drive. She opened an envelope with fingers that suddenly trembled. Inside were bank receipts, stamped and folded, a photograph of a ledger with handwriting she recognized, the looping pen of an accountant who had once done favors for friends. A thick sheaf of photocopied emails, dates and headers, and a few circled lines that mentioned service fees and consulting retainer, and a company name she had heard before, Meridian Hospitality, LLC. Beneath the receipts, tucked like a secret second lining, was a hard drive the size of her palm, and a notebook with pages filled in handwriting identical to hers. Notes, drafts, diagrams of algorithms with dates from 2016 and early 2017. Her breath caught. She smelled the cellar again, wood and damp paper, and a long-forgotten cup of coffee. Her hands shook in a way that felt younger than her age, like when she had first sat in a lab with a shaky pulse and a hypothesis she could not keep in a drawer. The notebook was unmistakable. Her canceled meeting annotations, the shorthand she used when she sketched process flows. Her name was on page 1, in her own looping script. She had backups in cloud folders, in encrypted drives hidden in the corners of her apartment, but those could be argued with. Metadata could be altered by someone with the right access. Someone could claim authorship by pointing to a server log that had been rewritten. But a dated, physical notebook with drafted diagrams, handwritten drafts that matched her known handwriting, was different. It was the kind of thing that could anchor a chain of origin. The hard drive, if intact, might contain the files she had once written and supposedly lost. For the first time in years, a dangerous little heat of certainty skittered through her. She closed the safe and sat down on the cellar step. The light hummed above her like an indifferent lighthouse. Her hands, those hands that had steadied cursor points and poured wine and signed with a softness she used only with a few who needed it, were covered in dust and ink. The name on the notebook looked like a mirror, like someone who might step out from behind the apron and reclaim a voice. She took out her phone and tried not to breathe loud enough for it to register on the microphone. There was the memory of Marcus's card folded against her sternum. She fished it out from her pocket and ran her thumb over the embossed initial. She did not touch the contents of the safe again. She photographed the exterior and the lip of the panel and the faded sticker reading "Accounting, Private." Then she put everything back the way she found it, made certain the panel sealed as before, and pushed the rack back into place. It looked, for anyone walking in the cellar after her, like nothing had happened. At home, under the thin light of a lamp, she texted Marcus a single line. "I found something. We need to talk. If possible, bring counsel." He replied in 3 paragraphs that read like a compression of 1,000 decisions. "Don't touch anything else. Document what you touched. Don't tell the manager yet. Meet me tomorrow morning with Charles Morrison, legal counsel. I'll have security with me. We'll log everything and secure the chain of custody." He wrote this with a kind of clean, resolute calm. The next morning, Anna met him by the back entrance of the restaurant, with an overnight bag slung over her shoulder and the worn hardcover notebook in a paper sleeve beneath her coat. She felt like someone carrying a small, living thing to be examined. Marcus arrived with 2 plain-suited men and a woman whose badge read Charles Morrison, Esquire, though she carried herself like someone who preferred the quiet of motion to the pronouncement of names. Marcus introduced them with a few words and an economy of gestures that said more than a page of explanations could. They wore the kind of attention Anna associated with law and with people who knew what to do. They did not barge into the cellar. Marcus stood in the doorway and looked at the wine racks the way he looked at any system he planned to reconfigure. Methodical, not sentimental. The lawyer produced a notepad and a small plastic evidence bag and explained, in a voice that sounded like a bridge over danger, how chain of custody worked in small human steps. They would document the discovery, photograph every surface, have a neutral photographer take high-resolution images, then call a licensed evidence custodian to pick up the contents and do a forensic image of the hard drive. The lawyer-manager was not to be told until the counsel assessed the risk of internal tampering. Anna's stomach clenched, not at the secrecy, but at the idea of inertia being replaced by a plan. They worked like pale detectives. Security cameras were reviewed. Timestamps were checked. The lock on the cellar was documented forensically. At one point, Anna watched a man in a black jacket run a lint-free glove over the panel and take a swab. A labeled evidence bag, sealed with a zip, and a printed code slid into a small case like a precious seed. Anna signed forms she barely read because the letterhead alone carried the weight of things she had no vocabulary for. Affidavits, preservation notices, memorandum of facts. David Chen's name crept into the recorded notes. Meridian Hospitality LLC's invoices that had passed through the safe contained payments to vendors connected to David's firm. There were penciled notations against certain dates, consulting fees paid to a shell company. The notebook pages, scanned, showed her handwriting with dates that predated filings now under David's name. It was beginning to hold together into a shape that could be understood by people who made a living translating paper into legal fact. Marcus's hands, when he finally held the notebook, had a steadiness Anna found strange and oddly protective. He did not pick up the phone to call the newspapers. He did not make any big statements. He arranged for a forensic copy of the hard drive. He made notes about patents and about potential witnesses whose early involvement might be significant. He spoke in strategic fragments: preserve, corroborate, document, prepare for challenge. At one point, he looked at Anna and said, almost casually, "This can be undone, Anna, but we have to be careful." The words were nothing like a promise of victory. They were the outline of a fight. For the first time since David had filed his first patent application, she felt the stirrings of something that had nothing to do with waiting tables. It was not yet the restored life she once imagined, a company founded, a team assembled, but it was a reclaiming of evidence, of narrative. She was no longer merely memorizing orders. She was forming sentences that could be argued in court and in press rooms. David, in his corner of the city, had a different morning. He read a briefing from his corporate counsel about due diligence and an approaching merger. His email was full of numbers, of legal caveats written in language that would keep shareholders calm. He had always been skilled at smoothing edges. Fingerprints of things he had once set in motion appeared on documents that now read like fiction he had authored from other people's work. He had been acquisitive, not malicious. At least that was how he explained it at night. The edges between ambition and theft had blurred, and he had convinced himself that he had been building, not stealing. When he received the terse, offhanded message that someone had secured a cellar in a restaurant connected to Meridian Hospitality and that a small, potentially incriminating artifact had surfaced, he frowned. He did not panic. He placed a call. "Find out who has access to that restaurant cellar," he said, voice flat with a practiced calm, "and see if anyone noticed anything unusual the last month." He started a list of people, names of managers, of night shift bartenders, of accounts payable clerks, and pushed it down the path of corporate reach. He had not yet allowed the idea of Anna into his thoughts. She was, if anything, an irritation on paper, the occasional name in old emails. He had not imagined her standing with a notebook in her hand like a witness. Anna spent that afternoon in a small office Marcus had arranged at his foundation space, a converted loft with brick walls and soft light. The legal team set up a photographer and a tech specialist who would produce a forensic image of the drive. The technician, a woman with a blunt bob and a gentle way of explaining complicated things simply, told Anna without condescension that metadata helped show not only when a file was created, but when it had been modified. An expert could authenticate timestamps and reconstruct the file's history in ways that a layperson found bewildering and comforting at the same time. "Nothing here is magical," the tech said. "We recreate the chain, verify it against known signatures, and compare to the public record. It's slow work. It doesn't end fights overnight. But when we combine a physical notebook with a drive that contains original files and server logs that corroborate the dates, you've got a pattern that's hard to argue away." Anna listened as if the words were equipment she might one day use. She felt beneath her ribs that same dangerous heat of certainty. Marcus did not hover. He let her speak to the tech in the language she once used before she reduced herself to service and smiles. She described variable weighting, the way she had tuned an algorithm to flag anomalies in transactional data. It was easy. Nervous hands do better with complexity than with idle conversation. Charles Morrison paced softly at intervals, and then sat, pen capping a small rhythm. He asked Anna about patent filings, about emails, about whether she had kept copies of drafts. "We need to know exactly what we've got," he said, not unkindly. Anna told him about the cloud backups she had stashed in encrypted folders, and about the drives she had hidden in a shoebox she had given to a friend for safekeeping. She told him about the day she had been locked out, how she had opened a ticket and never seen the replies, and about the sudden paper trail that had favored David. She did not dramatize the humiliation. She stated it. There was a legal power in clarity. At one point, Marcus found her alone in the converted loft with a mug of coffee turning cold in her hands. He sat across from her, his sweater soft and familiar, and said nothing for a long minute. She watched the movement of his jaw, the short, private pauses he took when he measured the weight of words. "You did the work," he said finally. "Whatever happens, you did that. That matters." Those words were simple and dangerous in their gentleness. They were human recognition, a kind of currency she had not allowed herself to accept in years. She blinked. For a moment, something like shame and gratitude and something more delicate, an invitation, unspooled in her chest. She let the feeling pass. There would be time to think about it later. Right now, the world was composed of papers and timestamps and legal breathing. Later, she could see what else might be possible. The next days settled into a rhythm that felt like a rehearsal for a trial. The tech did a forensic image of the drive, meticulous, slow, like a patient surgeon. Anna watched 2 monitors at once, seeing files appear as lines and then as visual signatures that had names she recognized. The imagers were taken into custody, documented with barcodes and signatures, loaded into a secure courier package that left with the sound of a locked trunk closing. The notebook was scanned in high resolution, each corner documented, each smudge preserved. A preservation notice went to the corporate defendants, freezing certain documents from being destroyed or altered. David, for his part, began to sense the faint pressure of a draft under a door. His counsel sent a terse note to his operations team requesting that they preserve all logs and communications relating to the Meridian hospitality contracts. He scheduled a meeting with a close advisor who had a tendency to soften the hardest corners of his personality. "We need to be sure," he said. "We need to be airtight." Outside the legal mechanics, small human failures and triumphs threaded through Anna's days. Sarah came by with a care package she called kitchen therapy, a thermos of soup and a second-hand scarf. She hugged Anna with the fierce, practical warmth of someone who had watched another woman be pushed aside. "You're doing the right thing," Sarah said. "Just don't let their lawyers scare you into silence." There were moments when Anna wanted to say everything at once, to tell every waiter and cook and dishwasher in the place that the woman among them wasn't simply a face on a name badge. She wanted to tell the room that she'd once written an algorithm that could read the bloodlines of contracts, that she'd lost herself to a man who had been a partner and then a utility. But Anna had learned the brittle cost of too much telling. She kept the stories tucked in the notebook and let the legal machinery do the speaking that had to be made public in the right places. Weeks moved like low clouds into the next phase. The forensic analysis returned with a handful of confirmations. The drive contained original source files that predated the dates on David's patents by months. There were emails with metadata that matched Anna's known login IP addresses on dates she had sworn she had been the originator of a draft. Mirrored backups suggested someone had, post facto, consolidated several versions under another account. The lawyer's report was precise without being greedy with its language. It positioned evidence as evidence, neither more nor less. It also made clear that nothing was decided. Evidence suggested a pattern. The pattern could be contested. The pattern could be explained away by a zealous but innocent assistant or by a design of company policy that pledged originality to those who filed the forms. The law was a maze of possibilities if one had the will and the funds to navigate them. Anna understood that the fight ahead required her to be patient and precise. Then came the moment that turned patience into a plan. A quarterly board meeting for the conglomerate eyeing the merger had been scheduled with little fanfare. The deal, as far as public perception went, was a strategic triumph. Marcus's counsel proposed a controlled exposure, an orchestrated presentation of the evidence to key decision-makers on the conglomerate's board in a room where visibility was enforced and where the legal team could at once hold both the truth and the power to escalate it. It was a dangerous move. High visibility meant high risk. If they misstepped, the pattern of evidence could be dismissed as personal grievance or opportunistic disruption. If they succeeded, the merger could be halted and a chain of accountability begin. Anna had mixed reactions. The idea of stepping into a boardroom as anything more than an apparition sent cold through her. Her instinct was to hide. Yet the notebook's paper felt like a pulse she had to protect. Marcus suggested, no, he insisted, that she would be the one to present the initial facts, to anchor the story in lived experience. He wanted her there not only as a symbol, but as the person whose handwriting had been cataloged into a forensic truth. "I won't be a prop," she told him, fingers tight around the rim of her coffee. "If I'm doing this, I do it myself. I won't let them rewrite my voice." He looked at her then with a look that mixed professional admiration with something quieter. "You won't be alone," he said, "but you're right. You will speak." There were rehearsals, soft, painstaking practice sessions in a small conference room with a whiteboard and coffee that went cold too quickly. Anna learned how to say her sentences in a legal register, what she had done, what she had seen, what the documents showed. The lawyer helped craft language that was unequivocal without being theatrical. They drilled on phrasing. "I authored" rather than "I think I authored." Metadata indicates rather than "they stole." The rehearsals were an odd blend of catharsis and work, presentation as therapy and litigation as confession. David's team, of course, did not sit idly by. He moved in that way people with reputations do, contacting contacts, double-checking filings, shoring up paperwork. He arranged his own legal consultations and began to assemble a narrative that made his filings look like strategic acts of business rather than acts of appropriation. He was careful, the sort of careful that made him dangerous. On the morning the presentation was scheduled, Anna dressed with deliberation. She bought a blouse she had not owned in years. Nothing extravagant, just a clean line and an air of being less apologetic for her space in the room. She threaded her hair back and tightened a simple chain around her neck, a small reminder of home. Marcus met her at the elevator. For a moment their hands brushed as she took the notepad, and then she saw, briefly, the anchor of an affection that had been forming in the quiet, confidential spaces between legal briefs and coffee cups. Neither of them acknowledged it directly. There was work to be done. They walked into the boardroom with the light outside cold and decisive. A glass table took up the center of the room, and a row of chairs lined the far wall where senior executives, their PR handlers, and a few curious outside counsel waited. A hush settled that had nothing to do with the thermostat. Anna's palms were steady in a way that made her surprise herself. She placed the notebook on the table like a small beating thing, and told the room she would start with what could be demonstrated, and that she would leave conclusions to the legal minds. She clicked through a modest set of slides, a timeline, scanned pages, email headers, a photograph of the ledger that had been inside the safe. The lawyer laid out the chain of custody with crisp clarity: discovered, documented, imaged, preserved. "We are not asking for someone to be convicted in this room," Charles said softly. "We are presenting facts that show a pattern of misattribution and suggest that further independent examination is warranted." David, who had arrived with his own equally composed counsel and a few board allies, presented an expression of measured curiosity. He listened, the way a man who had argued enough to know how to listen without surrendering ground does. There were points he would contest. There were explanations he had prepared. For now, he sat and watched as Anna spoke. She told the room, without self-pity and without flourish, where the notebook had been written, how the drafts had developed, and why the dates and drafting markers mattered. There was a murmur in the room, an undercurrent of the exact mixture Anna had feared and craved. A board member asked a pointed question about the scope of the manuscript. Another counsel inquired about the methodologies the tech had used to image the drive. The legal team balanced these with careful transparency. Marcus, sitting slightly to one side, offered a short remark about the need for integrity in partnerships and the reputational risk of ignoring such evidence. It was not a swipe at David, it was an observation with teeth. The session concluded with no climactic declarations, only a mutual awareness that something had been set into motion. The conglomerate's board voted to pause the due diligence clock pending a further neutral review. It was a small procedural move, but for Anna, it felt enormous. The pause meant leverage. It meant time to let patterns be analyzed and the record to be made public if necessary. It meant that the work she had once performed in code and coffee shops might be returned to a place of recognition. Outside the building, on the steps that led down toward the sound and the life of the city, Anna let herself breathe for the first time in months. Marcus stood beside her, his coat buttoned and his fingers folded into themselves. A taxi passed, blaring a horn like a small, impatient trumpet. The city moved on, indifferent and relentless. She looked at Marcus, at the man who had given her a card and then a plan, and for a soft second the future opened like a door she hadn't dared reapproach. "We still have to prove authorship in a criminal or civil context," Charles reminded gently, once they'd settled in a conference room where the air tasted faintly of lemon sanitizer. "There will be depositions, subpoenas, possibly an examination of servers. This will not be quick." "I know," Anna said. It was her voice, small but clear. Weeks bled into months. Some days felt like stanzas in a long song. Rehearsals, meetings, calls with journalists who asked careful questions and then put them back in their pockets. There were setbacks, a potential witness who recanted under pressure, a server log that had been partially overwritten and required expert reconstruction. But there were victories too. A vendor that confirmed payments consistent with the receipts from the safe. A dated envelope whose stamp matched the day on which Anna had claimed to hand over a draft to David's team. One late evening, Anna returned to the restaurant to collect a forgotten scarf. The night staff had cleared the dining room into a familiar husk. She stood for a moment beneath the chandelier, whose light had seemed, months before, to make her invisible. Now the lighting only made her face look tired and lit from within. She moved to the cellar as if she were visiting an old wound. The panel behind the wine rack was unremarkable. The safe was gone. Anna exhaled, not in panic, but in a strange, private gratitude. The safe had been taken into custody days after discovery. Its contents had been copied, sealed, and catalogued. The physical thing was no longer a hazard. She thought of the small sticky note Marcus had once placed on her notebook, "Hold to the facts." He had been right. Facts could be turned into a story, and stories could, sometimes, bend systems. That night, when she met Sarah by the pass for a late shift, the older woman's eyes were wet in a way that felt like an apology. "You did good," Sarah said simply. "You did more than most people would." Anna wanted to laugh, to cry, to make a list of everything the world had taught her to hide. Instead, she checked the tray and kept moving. The work and the small ritual of it steadied her in a way that legal rhetoric could not. She took each table like a small battlefield won. Then, in a Tuesday afternoon lull that had the kind of thin, midweek hush that suggests something is about to tilt, Anna received a call on a number labeled unknown. She picked up because she had learned in the slow school of being overlooked that silence could be a kind of danger. The voice on the other end was tentative, threaded with the kind of hush people used when they thought they might be overheard. "Anna, my name is Elena Cruz. I used to work in Meridian's vendor relations. I think I can help." Elena's words arrived in pieces. Names, dates, a delivery schedule that had always been off by a week, invoices paid to Éclat events, and then routed through Meridian's consulting ledgers. She remembered, she said, because she handled petty reimbursements and once noticed an unusual pattern of catering invoices that came from a handful of small restaurants, one of which had an address that matched a discrete storage unit linked to Meridian. She had been told not to worry. These were hospitality line items. She had copied a few receipts to her personal email years ago, before her access was revoked in a round of layoffs. She could forward them. Anna listened with a strange, detached attention, the way she had once sat in data meetings parsing outliers. This was not proof by itself, but it was a witness thread that might be woven into the rest. "Can you come in? Can you sign something? Our counsel needs to speak with you," Charles said over Marcus's shoulder, his tone clipped into legal space. Anna felt the room tilt into motion, the careful machinery of steps that turned discovery into evidence. Elena arrived 2 days later, wearing a thrift store blazer and a small, anxious grin. Her hands shook when she passed over a printed PDF, copies of email headers and 2 scanned receipts for event catering, both addressed to Meridian but paid out to small local names, and one with a handwritten note, "Private meeting, confidential." She swore she had the originals on a backup drive she had hidden when she left the company. She would provide those if given protections. Charles had a packet of non-disclosure agreements and a promise of witness protection rhetoric that sounded more procedural than dramatic. Elena read the forms like someone cross-checking syntax for spelling mistakes, and then signed. These were small things, handfuls of air, but they threaded into the broader shape of the case. The receipts, when matched to the ledger entries found in the safe, showed consistent payments that Meridian had classified as consultancy/catering in its expense reports. The name Meridian used for vendor routing had, on half the receipts, an internal reference that matched a vendor account David's operations team had controlled. Each match was a bead on a string. Over the next month, the team built that string deliberately. They issued subpoenas for bank records through the firm's outside counsel. They requested preserved logs and filed motions to prevent spoliation. Forensics reconstructed file histories on servers where Anna's drafts once lived. The text language, digestible and exact, entered Anna's everyday speech. Hashes, imaged copies, write-blocking devices. Experts compared timestamps to the metadata she remembered. Her own IP addresses, the timestamps of her cafe hours, the local backups she had stowed with friends. They all converged into a consistent picture. Copies and versions of the algorithm she had written existed on drives and in notebooks with dates that preceded David's filings. Payments corresponding to consultancy appeared in vendor records that tied Meridian to a web of small businesses, some of which overlapped with accounts used by David's side projects. David responded with the calibrated fury of someone trained in mitigation. He issued a statement through counsel calling the allegations speculative and opportunistic, emphasized his company's commitment to corporate governance, and promised an internal review. A PR firm spun a narrative about procedural irregularities and the complexities of acquisition accounting, language that smelt faintly of delay. When a blogger published a thin, anonymous piece about a disgruntled developer with a grudge, Anna felt the old, hot friction of shame rise in her chest. It was a reach, a cheap blow. Charles advised patience. "They will try to make this personal. We'll show them the paper." The smear had a cost. Friends offered the small, practical kindnesses of distance. Some colleagues at the restaurant looked at her the way people look at storms on the horizon, uncertain whether to seek shelter or watch. Sarah, blunt and unflappable, refused to let Anna withdraw. "Let them talk," she said, stuffing a thermos into Anna's hand. "You keep doing your job. They're loud now, but loud doesn't mean right." Anna kept doing her job. She threaded tables as if each tray might be the one to steady her. In the quiet between tickets, she rehearsed lines with Charles, and with a deposition coach who taught her how to answer simply, how to keep anger from spilling into testimony. She was learning a different kind of discipline. Speak the truth in plain English. Don't fill gaps with drama. It was a skill she had used with code, precision, and it translated into courtrooms and meeting rooms in a way that surprised her. One dull, rain-sketched afternoon, Marcus arrived at the restaurant without fanfare. He slid into a corner booth and ordered the same thing he always did: black coffee, no sugar. He watched the room with his habitual attentiveness. When Anna came by, he smiled with a small, private lift of the mouth. "They're filing a subpoena on Meridian's West Side accounts," he said. "We have a motion to freeze certain transfers. It will complicate their liquidity for the merger if granted." She sat with the tray unchanged in her hand, feeling the warmth of the coffee through the ceramic like a small domestic reassurance. "Will they retaliate?" she asked. "They will try," Marcus answered, "but retaliating recklessly gives us more room to tighten the net. This is the part where patience is as much a weapon as a document." He reached across the table and, with the gentleness his hands used when he signed small notes for his mother, touched the hem of her apron. It was a light gesture, the kind that meant a lot because of its rarity. Anna's pulse hummed, not with romantic fireworks, but with the sense of being seen, steadied. "Thank you," she said, and meant it in a way that asked for nothing in return. Weeks folded into procedural rituals. Depositions were taken in sterile conference rooms where Anna sat under the white arc of fluorescent lights and repeated facts, dates, times, where she had stored backups, without embellishment. At times, the lawyers for David's side attempted to excavate her personal life, to show motive, to reduce her to bitterness. They asked pointed, unpleasant questions about loyalty and about old lab partnerships. Anna answered each one with the same modest concentration she had always applied to code reviews. A few times she felt rage rise, hot and reasonable. She learned to let it be a calibration, not a soundbite. Outside the legal halls, public pressure swelled. The conglomerate paused due diligence. Investors asked for clarity. A regulatory body sent a quiet letter to both sides, asking them to preserve all potentially relevant materials. For David, these were blows that meant cost. For Anna, each procedural win was a ledger entry in the slow work of vindication. Then came a shift that felt like a tightening of a noose, but one placed around the neck of truth. Elena, whose testimony had been a small but stubborn thread, produced, after counsel secured assurances, a thumb drive with more scanned receipts and an email archive that included notes about private retention and an email chain between a Meridian project manager and a restaurant account manager who used a name Anna recognized, Marco Lena, the restaurant's operations manager. The email included a scheduling note that placed a meeting between David, Marco, and a consultant on a date Anna remembered, when she had delivered a draft in person. The archival email showed both payment authorization and a scanned copy of a separation agreement that had been signed by a consultant whose signature matched a name David had used in a filing. The new documents tightened causation in a way that made the pattern seem less like coincidence and more like method. They suggested a routinized process, small hospitality vendors used as cover for transfers, meetings staged in neutral places where records wouldn't immediately show a handoff. The safe had been a node in a network, and now another node had light shed on it. David's response approached a different register, intimidation thinly veiled as strategy. He filed a motion to compel Elena to produce the originals and argued that she had no standing to withhold them. He sent a terse legal letter to the restaurant's owner, asserting that the discovery of a private accounting box had been unauthorized and asking for confirmation of access logs. The owner responded in anxious compliance. His counsel drafted a statement acknowledging that a private box existed for discrete vendor payments and that its usage would be audited. The statement read as if it were a mop for water spilled on a marble floor. Marcus and Charles anticipated this. They moved faster to secure protections. Charles filed for an order that would require Meridian to produce key financial ledgers for independent audit and asked that the conglomerate's pause be extended until the neutral auditor completed their review. It was a bold move with legal teeth. The conglomerate's board, wary of both regulatory fallout and investor unease, agreed to the extension. The pause grew teeth. Public pressure could make a board cautious, but to bring down a deal required more. It required a moment of exposure in which a board member's concern met undeniable fact. Marcus and Charles crafted a plan that hinged on a neutral audit and then a controlled live briefing to the conglomerate's executive committee. The kind of room where optics mattered, but where legal teams from both sides would be present, and where the presence of independent auditors would make it harder for David to dismiss the evidence as a personal grudge. To prepare, Anna rehearsed the presentation until she could say the words without the taste of old humiliation. She had given the timeline before, but now she had new materials: Elena's emails, the receipts from the safe, forensic images of files showing creation dates before David's claimed authorship. The forensic team created a clear, visual timeline that layered evidence types: notebook pages with handwriting, server metadata, bank transfers, and the receipts. The aim was to show not a single smoking gun, but a consistent pattern that, when seen together, pointed to misattribution and possible criminal intent. The day of the briefing was cold and bright. Anna wore the blouse she had purchased, simple and unafraid, and a tailored coat for the walk from the car to the building. The boardroom felt both familiar and alien. She had been there before, but now the stakes were personal and public at once. Marcus sat beside her, a small island of steadiness. Charles chose his words carefully. David's counsel circled like litigious sharks. They began with the neutral auditor's report. A woman in a navy suit presented with the clarity of someone whose job was to interpret paper into law. She spoke about anomalous line items, about the improbability of pattern matching the degree to which Meridian's vendor payments lined up with shell companies favoring David's interests. She then handed the screen to the forensic tech, who explained simply how metadata confirmed file creation times and how the notebook pages correlated with drafts found on the drive. Anna spoke last. She kept her voice steady, telling the story fact by fact: where she had written, how the notebook had been stored, when she noticed the first alteration in the shared repository. She placed no soldierly flourish on her pain. She stated sequence and let the evidence do its work. When she showed a side-by-side image, a scan of her notebook page and a printed patent application page with nearly identical phrasing, there was a stir in the room, a soft breath like a wind that had been waiting to move. David watched like a man studying a weather system from inside a glass box. He had counsel's notes in front of him and a prepared, pale script. When the auditors concluded on a conservative note, "This evidence merits further criminal inquiry," the conglomerate CEO excused himself, saying he would need to consult with the board and outside counsel. For a moment, the room held. Then the CEO spoke publicly for the first time in the session. "Given these findings, we are suspending our consideration of the proposed merger and referring the matter to counsel for potential legal action." The words landed with the soft crack of a twig underfoot. They did not convict David, but they blew apart the delicately balanced promise of liquidity and growth his deal had depended upon. The pause would likely lead to further scrutiny from regulators and could cripple momentum. David's face lost color, then regained a practiced mask. He stood and delivered a short, furious statement about procedural defects and promised to contest any action he felt unjust. The first thing he did, in private after the room emptied, was send a terse email to his PR team asking for a narrative to reframe the moment: disruption, internal dispute, procedural hiccup. Outside the room, the press had already been notified by a cautious leak from someone on the conglomerate side who felt that public interest justified a measured disclosure. Headlines the next morning read with the cautious vocabulary of business journalism: "Merger pause after allegations of IP misattribution." The firm's stock dipped by a small but meaningful margin. Investors demanded updates. The cascade of financial consequence poured into the next set of legal actions. David reacted like a trapped animal, quick and doctrinaire. He filed countermotions asserting the audits were flawed and named the independent auditor's impartiality in question. He hired charismatic counsel to argue that Anna's testimony was self-interested and that timelines in code sometimes overlap, that iterative processes made authorship ambiguous. It was, in their filings, an argument that turned complexity into a shield. Anna's team responded not with anger, but with more evidence. a vendor who testified to payments, Elena's original drive that contained email headers timestamped before David's filings, snippets of code with unique function names that matched Anna's style, things a programmer might only have used. At some point, the fight moved into theaters Anna had only glimpsed from afar, depositions that felt like chess. David took the stand in one procedural hearing, only to be confronted by forensic confirmation that delayed documents had indeed been present on servers he claimed he had not authorized. He had to placatingly account for why versions bearing his metadata bore edits inconsistent with his handwriting. He insisted his team's chain of command handled filings, and that any inconsistencies were administrative errors. Yet in a deposition, under oath, such errors begin to ossify into the weight of pattern. As the legal machinery ground on, someone tried to weaponize Anna's personal life. A tabloid piece insinuated that Anna had once left a startup because of temperamental instability. The article was thin, sourced as people close to the matter. Marcus's team worked quickly, the PR playbook of a billionaire used with restraint. A clear, calm statement that Anna's competence and character were not in question, paired with a willingness to handle libelous outlets legally. The smear died a neat, embarrassed death. Public sympathy, which had been fragile, reconstructed around the image of a woman wronged and quietly relentless. There were darker moments. One night, Anna returned home to find someone had tried the building's intercom. A message scraped into the lobby log bore an incomplete name. Her landline received a call with silence at the other end. Marcus offered to have security stay at her apartment. She refused politely. "I can be brave on my own," she said, not because she wanted to, but because her courage had become necessary muscle. Marcus did more than offer security. He met Mrs. Blackwood with an openness he rarely showed in public. They spoke in the quiet, patient language of people who live long enough to understand the small economies of tenderness. Mrs. Blackwood, who had first noticed Anna in the dining room, told Marcus that the world had a way of making it easy for talent to be swallowed up by systems. She touched Anna's hand at a reading the two of them attended in a library, and the touch felt like a small blessing. It was domestic, human, and without dramatic rhetoric, exactly the kind of intimacy Anna needed after months of legal storms. The crescendo came in the form of an injunction request filed by Charles that asked the conglomerate to bring the matter to a shareholders' emergency meeting and that requested the court consider preliminary relief preventing Meridian from transferring or disposing of assets tied to the dispute. The court granted a temporary restraining order pending a hearing, which meant that the merger was not merely paused, it was legally slowed with the prospect of documentary exposure. That hearing became the day to which months of careful evidence led. The courtroom was full. Cameras were kept at a respectful distance, but the press presence hummed like a distant swarm. The judge, a no-nonsense woman with a reputation for clear rulings, listened to both sides. David's counsel argued vehemently. Mistakes happened. Innovation was messy. Charles responded with a lucid, devastatingly simple timeline and presented the forensic tech who explained, in plain terms, the impossibility of the metadata being a coincidence given the physical evidence from the safe. Elena's sworn affidavit appeared with the original drive attached. Anna testified about drafts and dates, reading a few lines in a steady voice that carried the weight of work done and work stolen. The judge, pragmatic, did not deliver a final verdict on guilt. She granted preliminary relief. The merger's progress would be halted until an independent review by a third-party auditor and a special master could complete an investigation. She noted that the evidence presented established a prima facie showing sufficient to justify the order. For Anna, it was not a criminal finding, nor was it a vindication with brass band. It was a legal hinge. The order meant the story would be investigated publicly and with procedural force. After the hearing, the air felt thinner. The pressure had not been lifted, but the path forward was clearer. David's options narrowed. He could fight, dragging the process into years, as some CEOs did, or he could settle, risk admission, or cooperate and hope to salvage some part of his reputation. He chose a mixture. He fought some motions, settled others, and his legal bills expanded like storm clouds. A federal inquiry, slow, careful, and with the kind of weight that can reshape careers, pressed into place. In the months that followed, as the legal web tightened around Meridian's transactions, the restaurant itself felt the reverberations. Regulators requested an audit of financial practices for several establishments shown in the ledger. The restaurant's owner, flushed and embarrassed, cooperated and posted a statement that they were committed to transparency. For a time, the place's bookings dropped as wary clientele checked headlines, and hygiene inspectors returned with a scrutiny unmoored from any particular roamer, but conditioned by procedural thoroughness. There was a palpable moment when someone in health services suggested a temporary suspension until the audit cleared them. The threat to the restaurant's livelihood had been real, and it had been provoked by the documents in the safe. But Anna refused to let the small business be collateral damage. Marcus, aware of the thin line between accountability and wreckage, worked quietly with the restaurant's owner. He connected them with an independent auditor who had no interest in drama, only in accuracy. They agreed to publish a full accounting of the receipts connected to Meridian, and to cooperate with authorities. The restaurant's owners agreed to court-ordered transparency measures, new accounting practices, third-party oversight, and an internal audit paid for by the owners. Measures that would make it harder for anyone to use their books as a blind spot again. In short, the safe's revelations had created the possibility of shutting the restaurant down. But because Anna, Marcus, and the legal team pursued a path of accountability rather than a scorched earth revenge, the choice became remediation over ruin. The restaurant weathered a bleak season of lost reservations, but because its owners chose cooperation, it survived. The moral complexity of that outcome sat with Anna. Truth had power, but truth wielded without care could cut more than the guilty. David's world changed in other, more irrevocable ways. A federal prosecutor opened an inquiry into misappropriation of trade secrets and potential wire fraud related to vendor payments. The indictment that would eventually be filed months later, when evidence had been thoroughly sifted, named individuals and shell companies. It did not explicitly mention newspaper headlines or impassioned blog posts. It talked about invoices, timestamps, coded transactions. To the public, it looked like the slow unspooling of an apparently well-constructed life. To Anna, it felt like the long, patient unthreading of a garment someone had tried to take. There were private costs. Anna endured depositions that dredged up embarrassing personal moments. She sat across from former colleagues who, when subpoenaed, remembered differently. She felt loneliness at times, an ache that even Marcus's quiet presence couldn't always soothe. But she also found allies in unexpected places. A young paralegal who had once interned at David's firm and who now spoke in guarded truth. A reclusive software engineer who had recognized Anna's code conventions in a leaked document and quietly corroborated authorship. The romantic thread between Anna and Marcus moved forward in small, ordinary ways. It was not the flash of cinematic passion. It was cups of coffee and legal offices, small gifts of practical warmth, Mrs. Blackwood knitting a scarf and pressing it into Anna's hands during a rare afternoon off, Marcus saying there is no hurry to define things when Anna fretted about social expectations. Their first kiss was not a dramatic reclamation scene, but a quiet evening after a hearing, when Marcus walked Anna to her apartment and they paused in the light of the corridor. He put his hands on her shoulders and told her softly that he admired how she had stood up. She kissed him because she wanted to, because after months of being defined by other people's versions of her life, she wanted to choose. Consent was clear and tender. That night, they spoke about small practicalities, coastlines of family history, what they needed from each other, and those conversations, more than fireworks, mapped how partnership might look. Legal resolution moved on a plausible timeline. Prosecutors built their case using the layered evidence: the physical notebook, the hard drive images, Elena's drive, payment trails through Meridian and vendor shell accounts, corroborating third-party testimony. David's defense offered explanations that sometimes made legal sense: administrative error, misplaced invoices, misfiled versions, but the accumulation of evidence made a jury of reality. Rather than a single dramatic confession, what followed was a cascade of legal incapacities: pleas, settlements on civil fronts that acknowledged wrongdoing without long trials, and an eventual indictment on several counts that would lead to a criminal process. The narrative that had once looked like a personal vendetta had become an institutional failure to enforce ethical IP stewardship. Anna's name began to appear in press pieces with the cautious reverence that only comes when someone is both a protagonist and a credible professional. Profiles spoke about her Columbia years, her quiet intellect, the notebook that changed everything. She did interviews with journalists who asked what it felt like to be invisible and then visible. She answered with a strange mixture of steadiness and the old, careful humor. "It felt like stepping into a light I hadn't turned on," she'd say, and mean more than one thing. 6 months after the initial discovery, Anna sat at a small table in a co-working space that smelled faintly of citrus and printer toner. A modest press cohort had been invited, no orchestrated fanfare, because she intended to announce a new venture. The brand was leanly named Martinez Technologies, a consultancy and small-scale product house focused on contract parsing tools designed with transparency in mind. She would not rebuild the old company exactly. That prospect felt like trying to fit a childhood house into a new life. Instead, she formed something with lessons learned baked into its practices: auditable logs, open authorship protocols, and a commitment to mentor other women in computational linguistics. Marcus was there, somewhere in the crowd, wearing a neutral jacket and an expression that had, in private moments, become softer. He had insisted on no press photos of them together that day. The partnership, he said, was their business to steward. After the press conference, as people lingered and asked polite questions, he took her hand and squeezed it. First a public punctuation, then a private signal. She slid her fingers into his with an ease she had not known 6 months before. The legal outcomes did not reduce to a single headline. David settled several civil claims and faced criminal charges that were moving through the federal courts. The legal process would not be a short one, but the trajectory had shifted. The conglomerate withdrew from the proposed merger and faced investor inquiries that forced corporate reforms. Meridian's leadership changed, new governance was installed. The restaurant regained foot traffic once the audit cleared them of willful complicity, though the aftertaste of the scandal lingered in staff conversations and in a tightened set of accounting practices. Anna's company launched modestly, with a small seed grant from Marcus's foundation and with clients who had seen the value of transparent authorship. Her first hire was Sarah, whose practical wisdom had been an anchor through the months. Sarah ran operations with the same practical heart she had given to the pass at Éclat. A small board included Charles in an advisory role and an independent engineer who had testified during the investigation. They built a culture where names were attached to contributions and where notebooks, digital and analog, were seen as instruments of record rather than relics to hide away. The engagement, when it came, was private in the way their relationship had been, not theatrical but considered. Marcus asked in a small garden behind Mrs. Blackwood's building, under a wisteria trellis stained with late summer light. He did not kneel with grand rhetoric. He simply took her hand, looked at her levelly, and asked if she would build a life with him, one that allowed for work, for travel, for faults, and for the work of making things right. Anna said yes. They both cried, quickly and in an embarrassed way, and then laughed because the enormity of the moment met the absurd domesticity of it. Marcus had chosen to ask in a place that smelled like rain and rosemary. In quieter months that followed, Anna's hands returned to the motif of small tasks that had sustained her: pouring coffee, threading a needle into an apron pocket for extra security, the rhythmic work of code with a mug at her side. The chandelier in the restaurant stood again as an emblem not of invisibility but of reclaimed visibility. It threw its light over a figure who was no longer a wisp. The safe that had been in the cellar remained in evidence custody until prosecutors released it as part of the record. The notebook, now filed into exhibits, had an owner who could state with a simple, measured sentence, "I wrote this." She sometimes visited the restaurant on slow weekday evenings when the city lights softened and the staff had time to trade small confidences. Sarah would slide her a plate without fuss. Mrs. Blackwood, who had been the first person to sign to Anna, sat by the window sometimes, knitting quietly, and they had developed a small, comfortable language of gestures between them. It remained always an anchor. The moral of the story settled into Anna in layers rather than in a single lesson. There was satisfaction in legal victory, yes, but also a deeper knowledge that justice required work and that accountability had costs. There was also the quiet truth that being seen by one person, Mrs. Blackwood in the dining room, Marcus in a coffee shop, had been a catalyst not because of romance alone, but because it had reopened a place inside Anna that allowed her to act. Seeing, it turned out, was sometimes the first work of being made whole. In time, public memory softened. The scandal remained a case study for legal seminars and for articles about corporate diligence. Martinez Technologies found niche clients and built tools that emphasized authorship and auditability. Anna, sometimes in interviews, would say that her hope was simple. "I want a world where ideas are traceable to people who made them, where small businesses won't be used as blind spots, and where being visible doesn't mean being vulnerable." Marcus, whose wealth had once insulated him from many pressures, discovered that wealth could be used to shore things up rather than to obscure them. He and Anna created a small fellowship to support women in computational linguistics and in entrepreneurship. They named it for a woman who had taught Anna to trust her handwriting, Professor Leila Navarro, who had insisted that notes be kept in hard copy as well as in file. On a clear morning months later, Anna stood once again in front of a conference room, this time as an invited speaker on a panel about ethical tech. She opened with an image: the wine rack and the hidden metal rectangle behind it. She did not dramatize what had happened. She told the facts in the exact tone she had learned in depositions: clear, unadorned, humane. She watched faces in the audience shift. Someone in the front row nodded like a person who had been waiting to be told that small acts could have consequences. That night, she and Marcus walked across the Brooklyn Bridge, an ordinary and ordinary enough ritual for two people who preferred to think in terms of long afternoons rather than single cinematic gestures. Marcus slipped his hand into hers, and she felt steady, as if she were walking home. The safe had been a hinge, the notebook a witness, and the slow legal work the asterisk that turned outrage into accountability. The restaurant, once threatened with closure for its unwitting role, remained open, changed, audited, and more careful. The power of secrecy had been met not with a ruinous hand, but with a methodical insistence on proof and process. Anna had reclaimed authorship and, in the process, found a life that allowed room for work and for love. She had learned that invisibility could be worn like a uniform only so long before it became a prison. What freed her was not a billionaire rescuer, but evidence, patience, and the steady human kindness that had made her risk being seen in the first place. If this story made you think about what it means to be visible, or if you found yourself wondering what you would do in Anna's place, leave a comment and subscribe for more narratives that explore justice, technology, and the messy, human ways they intersect.